Okay, TB Nation, you wanted it, you got it. It's time to talk about Bryan Callen. And this story is crazy. So while you might know Bryan Callen as a canceled podcast co-host, this scenario is more bizarre than it seems. Now, everyone knows Bryan likes to talk about growing up overseas, and people have started to point out the contradictions in his stories. And if you compile every time Bryan has mentioned his early life, he claims to have spent his entire youth in the Philippines, Pakistan, India, Saudi Arabia, Taiwan, Australia, Iran, Iraq, South Africa, England, Scotland, Arizona, Bakersfield, Boston, Tennessee, and the list goes on. So clearly he couldn't have spent his entire youth in all those locations, so what gives? Well, Bryan Callen actually has a rare neurological sleep disorder called Klein-Levin syndrome. And this is absolutely real. For all you doubters, go look it up yourself. But basically, Bryan never actually goes into REM deep sleep. And some of the side effects are that when he's awake, he experiences derealization, which is basically that REM mode in your brain turning on while you're awake. Well, this causes an alteration in his perception of reality and completely distorts the truth for Bryan. So when he was a child, apparently people noticed that Bryan seemed to be making up stories, and while kids at school probably thought he was just the liar kid who claims to own a roller coaster in his backyard, his family assumed this is just what children do and it must be a phase. But by high school, it became clear that Bryan wasn't lying for attention. He truly believed what he was saying. And when he started talking with a British accent after watching the 1973 film The Three Musketeers, his parents finally connected the dots. Every story about Bryan's life that he claimed was in fact just a movie he had watched. But because of his condition, he believed he had experienced any movie or TV show he ever saw. It's not that Bryan was gullible, in fact quite the opposite. If you told him he wasn't a Three Musketeer, he wouldn't believe that at all. Because in his mind, he had experienced decades of clever swordplay with his two trusty chums. And you can imagine how confusing this would be for people to tell you that half of the day you experienced was actually a dream. But once Bryan gets diagnosed with Klein-Levin syndrome, his family is relieved, and they see great improvement with him through medication and a strict regimen of no TV or movies. And Bryan would still experience these derealizations to a degree, but the fantasies were limited to more mundane scenarios. Well, apparently over time, Bryan's parents saw him lose his motivation and slowly start to even lose his personality. So even though they knew the social implications of his condition, they started letting Bryan watch one movie per week. But when high school ends, Bryan's parents aren't sure what to do with him. He's not really capable of living on his own at college, but they don't want him to get held back and not experience the world. So they send Bryan to a special acting camp. And this is a summer-long program that puts on plays, puppet shows, musicals, live acting events like Renaissance fairs, all sorts of interesting things that his parents knew would keep him occupied. And while at this camp, apparently Bryan for the first time goes from passive watcher and fantasizer to participant when he's actually put on stage himself. And at this summer camp, there were some real acting scouts who saw Bryan's performances and were stunned. They had never seen someone this young with this level of commitment to character. They could see that this was real for Bryan. And by the end of the summer camp, there was a junior manager bidding war over the brand new performer. And this is where the details get a little bit hazy. It's unclear whether Bryan's parents were okay with this or against it, but basically Bryan moves on his own to LA, and he's immediately working on big-name TV shows. Bryan Callen had the type of disarming charm that audiences wouldn't see again until Ryan Reynolds' amazing performance on Two Guys, a Girl, and a Pizza Place. And you can check this out for yourself on IMDb, but in the 90s, Bryan Callen was in tons of TV and movies. But then he gets sucked into MADtv, the then rival for Saturday Night Live. And this is where some say it gets cruel, because Bryan was often forced to be in a Speedo or appear completely naked on that show, only because head writer Bobby Lee thought it was hilarious to humiliate people. And looking back, it's clear that Bobby Lee and MADtv were abusing a person with a neurological disorder. And I don't know why, but Bobby Lee is always happy to tell the story of him taking a dump in a network executive's office to show his power, and how he forced Bryan Callen to eat it off the ground. You'd think this would be the type of thing you would want to hide forever, but for some reason Bobby Lee likes to blare this out on podcasts. And we all know the resentment from this incident has been carried since back then, and that's why Bryan Callen blew up at Bobby Lee on the phone and threatened him during the Great Brendan Schaub saga. He had finally had enough of Bobby's bullying. But that's another story. So back to Bryan working as an actor in the 90s. Well, everyone knows being on a network TV show is how Bryan meets Joe Rogan, and these two became best friends. Well, interestingly enough, it's around this time a brand new medication comes out that can completely suppress Klein-Levin syndrome. So Bryan gets prescribed this new medication, and he goes from being the enthusiastic, silly guy with wild beliefs to being a cutthroat business bastard. And this becomes a critical juncture in Bryan's career. You see, when Joe Rogan first got cast on The Man Show, taking over for Jimmy Kimmel and Adam Carolla, they were originally going to cast Bryan Callen alongside Joe. But Bryan had another TV show offer currently on the table, and this show he would be the lead rather than a co-host. So Bryan turns down his friend's gift and goes for the greedy option. And let's just say karma is completely real, because after signing the contract for this 4-season show, the production changes a critical aspect and decides to actually hide the host's face, apparently for his own safety. So behind the masked magician on the show breaking the magician's code is actually Bryan Callen. And in this role, we neither saw his face nor did he get to speak a line of dialogue. So this really did nothing for Bryan's career overall. Now eventually, just like he talked Bert Kreischer out of appearing on TV, Joe Rogan is able to convince Bryan Callen to get back on his Klein-Levin suppressant and go back to living a derealized life. And people have argued whether this was to help his friend or to squash any potential competition, but either way, after Bryan's 4-season contract ended, he was back on the suppressants and back to having a stable acting career, appearing in everything from Sex and the City to King of Queens. And in 2010, he gets his biggest and most beloved role of all, the lead in a parody comedy movie, The 41-Year-Old Virgin. Now, I don't have to explain this to anyone, obviously, but this movie was and remains the biggest comedy hit in America since 2007's Kickin' It Old School. A movie parody of a comedy movie. What could be funnier? It's literally double the comedy. So after this overly quoted smash hit movie sends Bryan to the upper stratospheres of fame, he becomes a hot commodity with many new younger comedians relying on his fame to boost their podcast numbers. And if you've ever watched Bryan Callen on any podcast, you'll know at some point he'll bring up his ability to fight and win any opponent in history. And people will play along with it like it's a joke or entirely shut it down like it's a joke, but either way, Bryan isn't doing a bit. Bryan truly believes he's experiencing whatever he sees on a screen, and that's why friends and family know to never show Bryan a horror movie. Now, Bryan Callen has indeed been cancelled by Bert Kreischer in the same manner poor Chris D'Elia and Brendan Schaub have been, by sending body doubles to commit crimes in their names. And sadly, none of Bryan's friends have defended him for fear of Bert Kreischer coming after them too. And there's plenty more about this weirdo, like the fact that he once again is off his Klein-Levin suppressors and has gone back to attempting to win by joining Steven Crowder and his team of sexy commentators voicing their opinions on pop culture. Or the fact that he's allegedly dating the mentally disabled Hawk-Tuah girl. But we'll have to save that for another time. Until then, Bryan Callen, you're a total bitch. Okay, if you've been keeping up with this channel, you know I've been hiding out in the forest now that the Austin Mafia wants to take me down. Well, I've managed to string together 12 extension cords and now have my mobile command unit up and running from an undisclosed tent. But I'm running out of ice packs to keep my computer from overheating. So do your part and spread the TB truth and fight against the Hulu heretics.